On behalf of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti, Ram Niranjan Jhunjhunwala College, Department of Physics, in association with IIPT Mumbai, I welcome you all to this third lecture of the lecture series. I welcome you all. Let me welcome our director, Dr. Usha Mukundan. Let me also welcome Dr. Himanshu Dauda, in charge principal. And of course, today's speaker, let me welcome Dr. Sinha. Let me introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker, our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Sitabhra Sinha, is currently professor at Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai. He did his PhD in nonlinear dynamics from Indian Statistical Institute, Calcutta. He has done his postdoctoral research at Department of Physics, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and then from Weill Medical College of Cornell University, New York. He has wide research interests like complex systems and networks, nonlinear dynamics and applications to pattern formation, statistical mechanics, and applications to social and economic phenomena, mathematical epidemiology, and so on. He has co-authored 2 books and co-edited 1 volume. He has published over 200 papers. 6 students have completed PhD under him. In the current context of COVID-19, you must have seen him on national channels for the analysis and interpretation of COVID data. His previous work also have been on the news channels. So let us hear from him. Let me tell you today's topic. Today's topic is epidemics, networks, and games. Before proceeding, let me give an important instruction to the participants. Participants, if they have any queries, can type their questions in the chat box. Their questions will be answered at the end of the session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Kiran, Dr. Usha Mukundan, Rekha Ghorpade, and Dr. Ratna Yadav for saying such kind words. So it's a pleasure to be here, and of course at the time of COVID, epidemiology is of course an extremely topical subject. But I thought when Kiran asked me to speak about some topic related to epidemiology, of speaking about something which is not directly connected, but nevertheless is very related to the topic of epidemiology and public health. So let me start my presentation. Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So what I'm going to talk about today have some implications for COVID, which I will point out. But, it's far more general. It's the question of why does vaccination programs, which have been, the singularly probably the #1 success story of 20th century medicine, why is it that vaccination seems to be failing? Why is it that diseases which we thought we had gotten rid of, decades back, making comebacks, right? So if you look at, the vaccines which are available, you find that there are vaccines available for a large number of diseases which affect humans. We have vaccines for shingles, hepatitis, whooping cough, mumps, tetanus, measles, chickenpox, rubella, and so on. So you'd have thought that all these diseases would be essentially unheard of because those vaccines are available for a long time. And yet we find that even developed countries such as the US are showing return of precisely these diseases. So for example, in recent times, we have had outbreak of measles um, again and again in the United States. Now, of course, you would expect that, if, sometimes vaccine preventable diseases have outbreak in some corners of India, you would say, well, we are after all not a well-off nations. Our, public health infrastructure has flaws. So probably it's not surprising that these diseases are making comebacks. But you can't say the same thing about the United States, right? It's the wealthiest country in the world. So why is it that something as preventable as measles is coming back again and again? And it's not just true for United States, it's true all over the world. So in fact, last year was a very bad year for measles, as many media outlets actually pointed out. So the answer has to do with the fact that people are simply not using the vaccines. Okay? As Amanda Cohn, who's the senior advisor for vaccines at the Center for Disease Control of the United States, said, there's vaccine hesitancy in a world where people don't see measles anymore. And that, in a sense, gives you a clue as to why we are still suffering from diseases for which vaccines have been available for a long time. So the truth is that despite the availability of vaccines, despite the fact that people have access to this vaccine, so it's not a case of the vaccines not being there, or for some reason the government not being able to get the vaccine available to the people. Even in countries with high vaccine coverage, individuals are opting out from receiving vaccines, or more importantly, from having their children being vaccinated. And what this does is that it creates space of opportunity for pathogens, which they exploit to start spreading within the population. So it's kind of surprising when you think about it. Why would countries which have vaccines readily available for their citizens, why in those countries would we have people who are not, in some sense, opting to take vaccines? Can we try to understand it? Okay. And as we are essentially modelers, as we use mathematical models to understand natural phenomena, obviously when we try to understand it, we try to use mathematical models to see if we can make sense of this phenomenon. So how do we go about this? So there are actually, if you think about it, two parts to understanding this problem. First, we need to understand how diseases spread through contact between individuals. That is, we need to model how epidemics arise and how they spread to population. Secondly, we also need to understand how do individuals take decisions to get vaccinated or to vaccinate their children. And so here what we are trying to understand is, suppose we are considering individuals in a population who have access to information about what are the possible outcomes of getting vaccinated versus not getting vaccinated. They have information about what is the incidence of the epidemic for which one is getting vaccinated. And based on this information, they are taking an informed decision. So we would like to incorporate both of these facets into our model in order to understand why is it that vaccine hesitancy is becoming such a big problem, so that diseases which we had thought we had completely cured are making comebacks. Now, of course, epidemics can be modeled at several different scales. So you can have very simple models for epidemics, or you can have very complex models. At the simplest scales, you could have diseases modeled as simply, something which any individual in a population, once infected, can pass on to any individual in that population. So in the tradition of physics, this would be akin to a mean field model. So in the context of epidemics, we call it homogeneous mixing or a well-mixed model. Okay? It's well-mixed because anybody can infect anybody else in the population. So obviously this means that we are not really considering here the fact that we live in spatially separate locations. So someone who's living in my neighborhood typically has much higher probability of infecting me than someone who's living in, let's say, the other end of the city. But in the homogeneous mixing, we essentially ignore this kind of spatial constraints. If you want to make your model a bit more realistic, you can start building in more and more realistic details, like you can bring in the details of social structure. So you can say, okay, how does the disease affect people at different age groups? How does it affect, let's say, people who belong to a particularly vulnerable section of the society versus people who have extremely, robust immune status? So you can try to bring this in. So you can also try to incorporate age structures. So for example, there are diseases of childhood, typically measles, which would tend to affect children more than adults. So once you start incorporating this age structure or other kinds of properties, you get models which have incorporated social structure. But you could want to, bring in far more realism by saying that, look, I'm far more likely to get infected by a disease if one of my friends has the disease, or if one of my family members has the disease, than, let's say, if some arbitrary person in the other end of the city has the disease. Because I'm much more likely to come in contact with my family members or with my friends. In other words, you are now incorporating information about your social contact network. Social contact network essentially contains information about who do you come in contact with typically over the course of your daily life. If you want to incorporate even more details, you could say, well, there are many different communities of which I'm a part. I could be part of my, family. I could be part of my friends network. I could be part of my workplace network. And how these different communities interact with each other could essentially tell us more about how the epidemic specifically propagates through a population. If you want to bring in even more realism, you could say, well, I'm not in contact with my family members all the time. I am only at home, let's say, before 8 in the morning, and let's say after 9 in the evening. Between 8 in the morning and 9 in the evening, I spend some time commuting. So if I'm taking a bus or a train, I would be, probably mixing with a lot of strangers. But then once I've reached my workplace, I'd mostly be in contact with my office colleagues. And then when I go out for lunch, I may be in close contact with, whichever restaurant I'm going to, or maybe the, person who is serving me my food. And then, once I am on my way back home, again, I'm on my commute. So, if I'm using public transport, again, I'm mixing with a lot of strangers. And then I'm back at home and mostly interacting with my family members. So who I come in contact with depends quite crucially on the time of the day, my own personal routine, and so on. So if you want to incorporate your daily movement, your daily routine, and the routines of everyone else, then you get what are known as agent-based models. So these are the most complex models you can have, which tries to bring in all possible information that you have about individuals in trying to understand how a particular disease is going to spread from one member of the population to another member of the population. The problem with very complex models is, of course, sometimes we just don't have that information. For privacy issues or for inconvenience of collecting those information, we may simply be unable to know not only what is your daily routine, but also who are you friends with. You may not be willing to give out that information, and I may not have access to technology which can actually get that information. So that's why simple models, even though they are of course an abstraction of reality, are sometimes very convenient to use to understand the gross level details of a phenomenon. And that's what we are going to look at first. So under the assumption of homogeneous mixing, that is, any member of the population is equally likely to infect any other member of the population, we can have a model for epidemic as follows. So we can have people in the population divided into 3 groups, okay? Or sometimes it's known as compartments, and that's why these kinds of models are known as compartmental models of epidemics. So what are these 3 groups? The first group is the group of susceptible people. So these are people who don't have the disease, but can be infected. If they come in close contact with an infected person, they can actually catch the disease. So this compartment is the one which is shown here in yellow, called S. The second group is the group of infected people. So this is the compartment which is shown in red, and it's labeled I. The third group of people are people who have had the disease, have recovered, and are therefore now immune to further infections. So typically, when you have a disease, you either develop immunity to the disease for your lifetime. So for example, once you've had measles, it's very unlikely you're going to ever have measles again. So, once you recover from measles, you have essentially got lifelong immunity to it. But if you got malaria, this is not true. So there are diseases which confer to you lifelong immunity once you have had the disease and you have recovered from it. But of course, this is not necessarily true for all diseases. So for example, influenza would give you immunity to that particular strain of influenza which affected you. But because the influenza virus mutates very quickly, typically being infected with influenza in one season will not confer you any protection in the next season when the influenza virus that is circulating is actually a different strain. So this group of recovered individuals who are immune to the disease, who are immune to further infections, is shown in green, and that's the category R. So how do people go from one compartment to the other compartment? How do individuals change their membership from, let's say, one group to the other group? Well, susceptible individuals, if they come in close contact with an infected person, can catch the infection and become infected and therefore join the infected category. So this can be visualized as something like a reaction where you say that S individual comes in contact with the I individual and with some rate beta becomes infected. So basically when you have a susceptible individual and infected individual come in close contact, then with some rate, it becomes an infected individual plus an infected individual. Namely, the susceptible individual becomes an infected individual. So this would result in the size of the susceptible group decreasing by 1 and the size of the infected pool increasing by 1. Now, what happens to the infected group? So the infected group is adding its numbers by getting people from the susceptible category who are becoming infected to join it, but they're also decreasing in size because people who are infected would eventually recover. So, of course, they can also die. So usually, we say that it's either recovery or removal through death. Both words, start with an R. And so therefore, in one shot, we can actually include death as part of the R category. So this removal or recovery is happening with a rate gamma. So if you're infected, then with a certain rate gamma, you're going to turn into a recovered individual. So beta is the rate of infection spreading and gamma is the recovery rate. And since rate has the dimension of 1 over time, it's pretty clear that the reciprocal of the rate would be a time unit, time constant. So what is the time constant? It's simply the average period for which a person is infectious. The average period for which a person remains in the infected category. So during this time, when a person remains within this infectious category, that person can infect susceptible individuals, thereby increasing the size of their pool. So this average infectious period, we will refer to as tau subscript I. So the two very important parameters that we need to note from this modeling exercise is that the entire epidemiological process is governed by two rates. The rate at which infection spreads when a susceptible individual and an infected individual come in close physical proximity, and the recovery rate. That's the rate at which previously infected individuals recover and become immune to further infections. So this idea was essentially given a solid mathematical footing by two British mathematicians, Kermit and McKendrick, in 1920s, when they wrote down a set of coupled differential equations to describe how the size of the susceptible population and the size of the infected population is going to change over time. Now, you might well ask, well, we saw three categories, right? We saw susceptibles, we saw infected, and we saw recovered. Why don't they have an equation for how the size of the recovered population changes? Why don't we have an equation for DRDT?
Sir?
Yeah. Yes? Sorry, was there something you want to tell me? Hello?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay. You might ask me, why is it that we don't have an equation for DRDT? For a very simple reason. The size of the susceptible pool added to the size of the infected pool, added to the size of the recovered pool, together equals the total population. And if you say that the total population is conserved, that means S plus I plus R is a constant at all times. And so if you write down an equation for DRDT, it's unnecessary because you already have a constraint, which is S plus I plus R equal to constant, which would make 2 out of those 3 differential equations only independent. So we are only focusing on the independent differential equations. In this particular case, we basically say that we are focusing only on how the number of susceptible individuals and how the number of infected individuals is going to change over time. So what do the differential equations say? So it says that if you look at how the number of susceptible individuals is going to change over time, it is going to decrease because when a susceptible individual meets an infected individual, that susceptible individual is going to become infected and going to join the infected group. So what's the probability of that? Well, you have S susceptible individuals and I infected individuals, right? So the probability that a susceptible individual meets the infected individuals by chance is basically a proportional to the product of these two populations. So if you have a large susceptible individual population, if you have a large susceptible population and if you have a large infected population, obviously the probability that a susceptible individual and infected individual are going to meet by chance is going to be very high. And so that's how you're going to have this product of S and I. Now, the rate at which such chance meetings between a susceptible and susceptible and infected individuals is going to turn a susceptible individual into infected individual is given by beta. And so therefore, beta Si will tell you what's the probability that a susceptible individual is going to turn into infected individual and thereby decrease the size of the susceptible pool. So that's why you have this minus beta Si on the right hand side of ds dt. Di dt would gain from such conversion of a susceptible individual into infected category. And so you have essentially the same term beta Si, but with a plus sign instead of minus, because whatever is the loss of the susceptible pool is the gain of the infected pool. And finally, because you have infected individuals recovering at a rate gamma and thereby leaving the infected group, you have the term minus gamma I. So beta Si minus gamma I tells you about the net gain of the infected population and will tell you how the infected population is going to change over time. Now, what's the condition that you'll have an epidemic? So what does an epidemic mean? Epidemic means that the number of infected individuals is going to increase over time. So essentially that means that di dt is going to be positive. So we can impose this condition on the differential equation. So, we have already seen di dt equal to beta Si minus gamma I. So we can say, well, if di dt is positive, that means beta Si minus gamma I is positive. So we can take I common, okay? And assuming that, there are no, very strange conditions, we can easily see that this would imply that at the initial stage of the epidemic, the size of the susceptible population should be greater than the ratio of the two parameters, gamma and beta. So what is the size of the susceptible population at the initial stage of an epidemic? So there are very few people who are yet infected and almost no one who is recovered. And so therefore, you wouldn't be too wrong to say that the susceptible population size at the start of an epidemic is exactly the total population size. And so basically you get the condition that n beta by gamma has to be greater than 1 if there has to be an epidemic. But what is 1 by gamma? As we saw in the previous slide, 1 over gamma is simply tau I, the average infectious period. So I can now rewrite the condition n beta by gamma greater than 1 as simply n beta tau I greater than 1. So this product of the size of the population, the rate at which infection spreads from individual to individual, and the average period of infectiousness, this product has to be greater than 1 for you to have an epidemic. So this quantity is so important as a criterion for deciding whether you'll have an epidemic or not, that the quantity, the product n beta tau, is actually given a separate name. It's called the basic reproduction number. I'm sure you must have heard this basic reproduction number talked about a lot in news channels, because people are very concerned about estimating this basic reproduction number of the COVID-19, because it tells us how quickly the disease is going to spread. So if we look at the simple models of epidemics, we immediately get the impression that epidemics, at least initially, are going to grow exponentially. It's intuitively also easy to understand why. So suppose an infected person on average infects 2 others, and those 2 would in turn infect 2 others, and so on. So what will happen? So at initial time, let's say there's only 1 infected individual. After a while, that infected individual has infected 2 people. After a while, those 2 have infected 2 into 2, 4 people. After a while, those 4 people have infected 4 into 2, 8 people. After a while, those 8 have infected 16. Then those 16 have infected 32. Those 32 have infected 64. Those 64 infected 128. 128 have infected 256. And very soon you get an exponential increase in the number of infected people, which is what is shown schematically in this slide. So sometimes, of course, infected person may not be able to pass on the infection. So that's why we are talking about the average number of people a person passes this infection on to. So this number, how many people on average are infected by a single infected person, this is what the reproduction number is. That's the essential meaning of a reproduction number. And so if you have a R0, if you have a basic reproduction number, which is greater than 1, you would have an exponential increase in the number of infections, and you have an epidemic. So it is very important when you are faced with an epidemic like COVID-19 to try to estimate the reproduction number at various points of time and try to see how close it is coming to 1. Because if you have made it 1, effectively that means the epidemic has been contained. On the other hand, the bigger it is, the larger it is compared to 1, the faster it means the disease is spreading. Now, we often talk about plateauing of a disease or when the disease reaches its peak. Typically, that's true for any epidemic. So initially, a disease grows exponentially, and then after some time, it reaches a peak when we say that it is saturated. After that point of time, it starts falling and eventually dies out or becomes endemic. Why does it reach saturation? That essentially has to do with the fact that eventually the pathogen finds it harder and harder to find fresh susceptible individuals as hosts. As more and more people become infected in the population, a pathogen which is trying to find a home for itself as it's growing suddenly finds that there's everyone around the particular host it is in right now is already recovered or infected. Okay? So if there's no susceptible individuals, it cannot jump to that individual and start growing again. Okay? So at that point, we see that the epidemic has reached a peak. And then after that point of time, because susceptible individuals have become very rare, so they become very hard to find for the pathogen, eventually the disease will start dying out. So we can characterize various diseases by their basic reproduction number. So the higher the R0, the more contagious the disease. So for example, hepatitis C is about 2, Ebola, which is, has been in the news a bit before COVID-19, of course, completely swept it out. It's a, extremely lethal disease, but fortunately it turns out it's not very contagious. Its R0 is only about 2. COVID itself, the R0 has been estimated to be between 1.5 and 4, depending upon which region you are looking at. HIV has a R0 of 4. SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which has some similarities with COVID-19, turned out to have R0 of 4. Mumps has 10. Measles has an extremely high R0, somewhere over 18. Now, why is R0 important? Apart from the fact that it tells you how quickly the disease is spreading, it can also help you in finding out what is the minimum immunization coverage that is required if you want to control the epidemic. So, it's a simple bit of mathematics to show that you need to immunize a P fraction of the population where P has to be greater than 1 minus 1 by R0, where R0 is the basic reproduction number. So if you're looking at measles, which has R0 between 12 and 18, we are talking about you have to immunize something like 90 to 95% of the population before we can eliminate the measles epidemic. Smallpox, on the other hand, which has R0 of 5 to 7, requires about 80 to 86% of the population to be immunized. Influenza, which has between 1.2 to 1.8, requires 33 to 44% of the population to be immunized. So what is important over here is to prevent an epidemic, we don't actually need to have 100% vaccine coverage. And that's very important. So we all know that smallpox has been eradicated. How? Well, by vaccination, right? But how is that possible? Because, obviously there are populations around the planet whom we have never vaccinated. There are people in the North Sentinel Islands of the Andamans who has never encountered civilization. So the question of vaccinating them from smallpox doesn't arise. So how is it that we can say that smallpox has been completely eliminated from human population? That's because we have managed to take the vaccine coverage beyond, much beyond this critical number, which is given by the theory. So it tells us that even if a single person gets infected with smallpox by some random accident, it will never turn into an epidemic because there is enough immunity around that person to contain the disease. So this tells you about why immunization actually manages to contain so many diseases. It's because of a social benefit of immunization. Immunization not only benefits the person who is getting the vaccine shot, it's also benefiting the community at large, even people who are not getting vaccinated. That's because of a phenomenon which we call herd immunity. So in herd immunity, the very fact that a large number of the population has gotten immunized against the disease means that even if the pathogen suddenly makes an appearance in the middle of the population, it's not going to make much headway because it's not going to find a susceptible individual person easily in that population, which is mostly made out of immune individuals. So the more members of the population are immune, the harder it is for the pathogen to find a new host to continue reproducing itself. So if it cannot find a new host, it basically just dies. Right? So if you can vaccinate enough number of individuals, it need not be 100%, it need not be the entire population, you serve a social good in the sense that now even people who are not immunized, who have not received the vaccine shot, are protected because they are protected by this crowd of vaccinated individuals who are like acting as a screen for them, protecting them from the pathogen. Now, we have been talking mostly about well-mixed population, where we say that everyone in population is equally like to infect everyone else, but we know that that's not true, right? As I mentioned, that I'm much more likely to get infected by a friend or a family member than from some arbitrary person in the other part of the city. So how do we bring in this realism into a model? As I mentioned, we have to take into account our social network. So what's a network? A network is any structure which we can describe in terms of components, which are called nodes or vertices, and the links or edges, the interactions which connect these components. So together, the set of components and interactions is known as a network. So in our particular example, the components are the individuals, the interactions are the actual contacts which result in the contagion to go from one individual to another, and the system is of course the population over which the epidemic spreads. So there are several very nice social contact network data sets which actually exist in the literature. And one such is a wonderful data set which was collected by NGO known as Bharata Svamiti Samaste, which a few years back essentially surveyed several villages in southern Karnataka and went to each village and recorded who each individual of the village comes in physical contact with over the course of his or her day. So for example, which shop do you go to? Which shopkeeper do you have regular interactions with? Which temple do you go to pray? Who are your friends? Which tea shop do you go to? Who are the others who come to the tea shop at the time when you are there? Who do you talk to? Who do you have conversations with? Who are your family members? So, based upon all your possible contacts, a very detailed social contact network was constructed for a large number of villages. So when we carried out a simulation of an epidemic in this social contact network, we found that the propagation of disease in these kinds of social network actually has a very interesting behavior. So here I'm showing you a simulation in which the blue circles represent individuals who are susceptible to the disease, red corresponds to people who are infected, and green corresponds to people who have recovered. And I'm talking about a disease where essentially after a while, you lose your immune status and you become susceptible again. So notice what happens. Initially, the disease runs through the population. A lot of people get infected, and then the people become recovered, but a few remain infected. Okay, and a few people have now lost their original immune status, have now become susceptible again. So what happens is that over the course of many seasons, the disease again and again runs through the population as people become susceptible, then get infected, then recover, and then over the course of time lose their immune status and become susceptible again. Surprisingly, when we actually looked at networks which do not have these kinds of community organization, so one of the important things which I want you to note over here is that here the individuals have what is known as a community organization. In other words, people tend to have most of their connections clustered within a particular group, which is not very surprising, right? Because our societies are normally have this community organization where we mostly have interactions with our own community and very infrequent contact with people outside our community. And that's also not, different in the case of the Karnataka villages that these people obtain their data from. So each of these clusters actually correspond to specific communities, and you can see that most of the contacts are within the specific communities. That's why you have this clustering. So when we looked at networks which don't have this community organization, we found that surprisingly, the epidemic actually flashes through the system and then just disappears. And then after that makes no comeback. But for populations which have a very strong community organization, like the social contact networks of these Karnataka villages, we find that the epidemic goes up to a point, then starts decreasing, and then starts all over again, then starts decreasing, then starts all over again, and then starts decreasing. And this goes on forever and ever and ever. The disease never goes away. It remains persistent in the population for a very long time. And so this tells us that for diseases which mutate for whose pathogen may be mutating very frequently, so that you essentially lose immunity for that disease over course of one season or several seasons, a community organization is very, very likely to make the disease extremely persistent. So this was just to show how important social contact structure is. And so what we do is we take a model where there is social contact structure, and where we have divided the population into these three categories: susceptible, infected, and removed or recovered. And when a person becomes recovered, that person moves from a susceptible pool to an infected pool. And when that infected person recovers, that person joins the recovered or removed pool. However, once you introduce vaccination, you have one more possibility. A susceptible person can directly join the immune people in the removed category through vaccination. And so we will consider each of these as corresponding to different rates. So the infection is governed by the beta, the rate at which susceptible people meeting infected people gets infected, but it's also controlled by the number of infected neighbors that typically a susceptible person has. And this information is actually given by your social contact network. The recovery is controlled by gamma, which is the reciprocal of the average of the infectious period, which is tau I. And finally, the vaccination probability of an individual is given by pi. So this tells us that we have essentially completely specified our disease transmission model, how the epidemic propagates through the system. But now our entire model hinges upon finding out how we are going to have this vaccination probability decided. Okay. So this comes out of the vaccination decision model. So how do we model a process by which agents take or individuals take decisions to vaccinate themselves? So assuming that agents are rational and are not just scared for no reason for getting an injection or whatever, that these are all adults that we are talking about. Even if it's about children, it's the adults who are making the decisions, so it's fine. So assuming that these are rational individuals, they are presumably trying to maximize their personal benefit, which is based upon the information which is available to them. So this, of course, is fertile ground for using a very well-known theory, the mathematical theory of games. because that looks at how individuals take decisions based upon various strategies and based upon the information which is available to them. So when we talk about games, what we mean are essentially any strategic interaction between agents. And agents could mean, human beings, but they could also mean, in other contexts, animals, cells, organizations, nations, and sometimes even, bots, even programs could be thought of as agents. But of course, in the context of epidemics, we are primarily thinking of individual human beings. Each individual receives a payoff, which depends upon not only the strategy chosen by that person, but also the strategy chosen by all her opponents. And agents, as I already said, try to take a decision which would maximize their payoff. So this theory of games essentially is an offshoot. It comes out of a long tradition of using games to understand strategic decision making. So for example, in the 19th century, people would play war games. Actually, war games are still played, but typically more in computers these days. So the simplest way to understand games is to think in terms of what is known as a two-person symmetric game. So in a two-person symmetric game, you have two individuals, A and B, each of whom has the option of choosing action 1 or action 2. And so each agent would receive a payoff depending upon not only what he or she chose, but also what her opponent chose, what the other agent chose. So for example, if both chose action 1, then both get a payoff of R. If both chose action 2, both get a payoff of P. But if agent A chose action 1 and agent B chose action 2, then agent A gets payoff of S and agent B gets a payoff of T. And exactly the opposite if agent A chose action 2 and agent B chose action 1. Now, you could have a pure strategy where you either choose action 1 or action 2 with probability 1, or you could have a mixed strategy. So you could have some probability, let's say 0.5 of choosing action 1 and 0.5 of choosing action 2. Okay, so these are called mixed strategies. Now, how do we decide, given the payoff matrix, which action to take? So the famous mathematician John Nash came up with a solution paradigm, which essentially gives us a prescription that given a matrix of payoffs, how to decide which strategy is optimal, in the sense that once we have decided, once we have come up with this optimal strategy, any one player deciding to do something else will not be better off. So that's the concept of a Nash equilibrium. Now I understand that this may be really abstract. So let me give you an example to make this appear less abstract. So imagine that you have two thieves, or a thief who has stolen diamonds and a fence, who would be buying those stolen diamonds of the thief. So because of police presence, they cannot really, go to each other's house and, have this transaction in the safety of their house. They have to meet at some secluded location and quickly exchange suitcases and then go their separate ways. Okay? So because the police are around, they do not dare open their suitcases and check whether they have got what the other person says the suitcase has. Okay? Now, the thief has the option of either giving a suitcase full of diamonds to the fence or giving an empty suitcase. Similarly, the fence has the option of giving a suitcase full of banknotes to the thief or giving an empty suitcase. Now, if both are, honest thieves and honest fences, what will happen is that they will cooperate. So the thief will give the suitcase full of diamonds to the fence would give the suitcase full of money to the thief. Everybody is happy. But of course, the thief has this temptation, right? That, maybe I can get away with giving an empty suitcase and receive, a suitcase full of banknotes. So, like I'm twice rich. I have the diamonds. I haven't given it away. On top of it, I have all these banknotes. Okay. So, it might decide to defect, right? It might decide to do the bad thing. So it might decide to be dishonest. So it gives a empty suitcase, no diamonds, to the fence, and the fence gives, in all good faith, the suitcase full of notes to the thief. Okay? So the thief defects and the fence cooperates. But you can also have the opposite situation, right? So it could be that the thief acts in good faith, so gives the suitcase full of diamonds to the fence, takes the suitcase offered by the fence, and when comes back home, he finds it's empty. There are no banknotes, right? So both parties have this motivation or temptation to defect. But if both decide to defect, what happens? Both go home and discover that they have empty suitcases. Right? Okay. Now you might say, okay, they are not really losing anything, but the diamond thief cannot stay with diamonds, has to sell it off and turn it into useful things. And the fence also needs to get buy those diamonds because maybe he has a diamond shop or whatever, right? So in some sense, both would have been better off if they had been more honest. But in their greed, they were worse off. Okay? So Nash would say that how do you come up with the optimal strategy? So Nash would say, well, since I don't know what the other person is going to do, look at your payoff matrix and ask for each option taken by the other person, which is your best option. So for example, let's say you are the seller, you are the thief, okay? Now you don't know what the fence is going to do, but suppose you say, well, let's assume the fence is going to cooperate. That is, the fence is going to give you the suitcase full of money. Okay? So which is your best option? Which actually gives you more profit? Well, you could cooperate, but in that case, you lose your diamonds. You would get a bigger profit if you actually give an empty suitcase, in which case you have the diamonds and you also have the money. Right? So in this particular case, if the buyer had cooperated, you're better off defecting. You'd have more profit. On the other hand, if the buyer defects, then which is your best option? Obviously, if you give away your diamonds, you lose, right? So it's better to give empty suitcase. So it turns out that according to Nash, whether your buyer is cooperating or defecting, you're better off defecting. So the thief is very happy. He thinks he has found out a winning strategy. But of course, the problem is the fence is also exactly using the same theory. The fence is looking at the payoff matrix and realizing, look, no matter what the thief does, I'm better off by giving an empty suitcase. And so in the Nash solution, both would end up giving empty suitcases to each other and ending up losers than if they're bit less intelligent and being more honest. So this is known as a social dilemma. That sometimes what would appear individually to be the most rational strategy collectively may turn out to be less optimal than a less intelligent strategy. Now, prisoner's dilemma is not the only possible games that there are. So for example, you have other games like chicken. So this has sometimes been used to model nuclear armed conflict between superpowers. So essentially what differentiates one game from other are the values, relative values of these payoffs, P, R, S, and P. So remember, when I showed you the two-person symmetric game, I showed you a payoff matrix. So this R, S, T, and P corresponds to the different values of the payoffs. And the relative values of the payoffs are what differentiates these games from each other. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with vaccination? In vaccination, the players are the various individuals who are deciding whether to vaccinate or not. So the actions are vaccinate or not vaccinate. So what are the payoffs? The payoffs have to do with what's the risk of actually getting infected and maybe dying from the disease, and what's the cost of vaccination. Now, cost of vaccination need not be monetary cost. It could be, for example, the effort of actually going somewhere and getting the vaccine shot. It could be side effects of the vaccine. It could be a lot of things, right? Non-monetary, for example. And so you can write down a payoff matrix where if both people vaccinate, both pay cost of vaccine, but the gain in the sense that neither have risk of infection. If they both decide not to vaccinate, they don't neither pay the cost of vaccine, but both have high risk of vaccination, high risk of infection. Now, what happens if one person vaccinates and the other person doesn't? So the person who vaccinates is now paying the cost of vaccination, but at a also doesn't get the full benefit of vaccination, right? Because the epidemic may still occur because other individuals are not deciding to vaccinate. Okay? So this tells us that we can actually have a game theoretic setup in which we have agents looking at what is the incidence of the epidemic at a particular point of time, thereby estimating the risk of contracting a disease, what is the risk of actually getting infected given the incidence of disease, given what is the number of infected people in my neighborhood, and then on the basis of that deciding whether to vaccinate or not. And so what we can do is we can couple the epidemic propagation model with the vaccination model. In the first step, we have the infection spreading through essentially the social contacts that we have in the individuals, which results in the change in the prevalence of the disease. And in the step 2, each individual, based on information about how many individuals in the population are infected and how many individuals around it are vaccinated, decides whether to vaccinate or not. So using the prevalence information is, of course, a very important step because you can choose to either use the global prevalence information. You can decide to look at what is happening in the entire population, over entire India, how many people are infected, or you can decide to use local population, how many people are infected in my neighborhood. Okay? And it turns out that this is actually a very, very important criteria. So we use essentially a mix of local and global population in our model. And if we choose the parameter alpha 0, that means our population is, our individuals are using entirely local information. If alpha equals to 1, on the other hand, our individuals are using entirely global information. And then we have these decisions which are made by these rational agents according to a game theoretic setup. So again, we use our empirical social network and we carry out the simulations for different setups. For example, here we are showing 2 situations. In the left, we are showing the situation where individuals are using entirely local information. In the right figure, we are showing the situation where individuals are using only global information, only what is happening in the entire population. And as you can see, the way in which the epidemic propagates, so here blue circles correspond to susceptible individuals. The maroon circle corresponds to people who have infected and then recovered, and yellow circle corresponds to people who have decided to get vaccinated. So you can see that they are quite different. So there are more people who are getting infected in the right-hand figure compared to the left-hand figure. Indeed, that is what we see. So for the Karnataka social networks, when we try out these simulations for many different village networks, we find that typically cases where people are using local information to decide whether to vaccinate or not results in better outcomes. Less people get infected once the epidemic runs its course, and also more people have gotten vaccinated by the end of the epidemic, as compared to when people are using global information. So this is somewhat confusing, right? Both are epidemiological information. Both basically tell you how many people are getting infected. So why is it that local information use has better outcomes than global information use? Well, let's look at what global information is doing. When you're using global information, initially the disease prevalence appears to be low because you are dealing with an extremely large population size. So suppose you are in a particular city of India. Compared to that city, India's population is huge, right? So, the number of cases might be, let's say, a few hundred, and you would say, okay, it's just a few hundred, right, in this enormous country of ours. But if it's all in your neighborhood, you have to be pretty careful, right? That it may directly affect you, or even if it's in a neighboring city, it may actually come to you. So the problem with using global information is that it may not appear to pose a severe threat or an immediate threat. So by the time the prevalence in entire population becomes high enough that people start getting aware of the risk, epidemic has already affected a large fraction of the population. And so people take this decision to vaccinate too late, And even though a large vaccine coverage might result, this would not may have any effect in reducing the epidemic size. On the other hand, if you have local information, then you can actually have a much more realistic assessment of what's the chance that you're going to get infected, and you're going to take a much more prompt decision to vaccinate. So this is like the Kanban principle of Japanese supply chain management. The right dose at the right time, the right amount at the right time. And we find that this is not only true for the empirical social networks, but also true for model networks of all kinds that we have tried out. Moreover, it doesn't seem to be affected by the size of the population that we're dealing with. Now, from a physics point of view, there are some very interesting aspects of these kinds of models. It turns out that if you look at what is the vaccination fraction as a function of the contagiousness of the disease. So remember, the contagiousness of the disease is measured by the basic reproduction number. So here, each of these panels has to do with a particular state of information we are using. So suppose we're using entirely local information. We look at, for a given basic reproduction number, what is the number of people who are going to get vaccinated? So, if the disease has very low contagiousness, not too many people get vaccinated. If the disease has high contagiousness, a large number of people get vaccinated. And you see this no matter what kind of information you're using, okay? Whether local or global, or some judicious mix of local and global. But interestingly, if you look at how this transition from a few people getting vaccinated to a large number of people getting vaccinated, if you look at how this transition occurs, you find that when you're using local information, that's a discontinuous phase transition. Whereas if you're using global information, that's a continuous phase transition. So this tells us that there's a crossover which is occurring depending upon the amount of information, the state of information we are using. In other words, we have bimodality when you're using local information, or when you give higher weightage to local information, and you have unimodality when you are using global information. And to go from a low vaccination to a high vaccination state, you go through a coexistence phase when you're using local information, whereas you go much more continuously when you're using a global information phase. So let me conclude by summarizing the key points of what we talked about. So understanding vaccine hesitancy is very important when we see that many of the diseases which we thought we had cured are making comebacks. And we need to understand why people are refusing to take vaccines, even though vaccines are available and easily obtainable. It has to do with the fact that vaccines have been actually too successful. People find that the epidemics do not pose a severe threat, so they say maybe I don't need to get vaccinated. Right? So I have better things to do on my Sunday than getting vaccinated, than getting my children vaccinated. So we find that the decreasing disease incidence reduces the risk perception, which is what is causing vaccine hesitancy. So we model this by A, looking at how diseases spread over social contact network, and B, looking at how agents decide whether to get vaccinated or not by taking strategic decisions based upon the information available to them about how likely they are to get infected and how many people around them are already vaccinated. So if a lot of people around them are vaccinated, they feel less incentivized to vaccinate themselves. Importantly, we find that people who use local information are much more likely to get vaccinated, and you have a much higher vaccine coverage than the cases where people are using global information. It turns out that the social contact network really doesn't affect the results much, except the average number of contacts a person has. So depending on the average contacts that a person has, you can actually determine what would be the optimal information criteria which actually drives people to go and get vaccinated. Now, if you are wondering, what does this have to do with COVID? Okay, so for example, you might ask, okay, maybe this doesn't really have much to do with COVID because COVID doesn't even have a vaccine. Well, interestingly, it turns out that the same argument that I have made with respect to vaccination goes through if instead of vaccination, you think of physical distancing measures. So, the government is asking you to adapt physical distancing measures and public hygiene measures like wearing a mask, washing your hands and so on. Now that's a decision that each of us are taking. right? Even though, there might be some coercive measures, police might stop us and arrest us if we are not wearing face masks. Police are not everywhere, right? So we do have some, volunteering agency in deciding whether to do this or not. So suppose, you are deciding, do I wear a mask? Don't I wear a mask? Do I adapt physical distancing? Don't I adapt physical distancing? You are, of course, in some sense, using strategic decision making to decide what to do. And in the back of your mind is the thought that what if no one else is doing what I'm doing? In that case, it's pointless doing physical distance, right? If everyone, is like blasé about, what's going to happen, the disease epidemic is going to spread anyway, no matter what I do. So for you, it is very much a decision which is based, whose utility is based on what other people decide. And it turns out that, if everybody decides that, well, if everybody, adheres. So for example, like this cartoon of Dennis the Menace here, Dennis is asking his mother, look, if everybody's getting a flu shot, why do I need it? Because, everybody's got vaccinated. No one's going to catch the disease. So I'm safe, right? So similarly for physical distancing, right? Someone might argue that, well, everybody's wearing a face mask. What does it harm, if I'm the only person who's not wearing a face mask? The problem is, of course, that if everybody argues this way, everybody's going to go out without wearing a face mask. Everybody's going to engage in risky behavior, and the epidemic is going to spread like wildfire. So understanding how people make strategic decisions is not only important in understanding how vaccination programs succeed or fail, but also, for example, how containment measures, public hygiene measures that, agencies, that government agencies are asking people to adopt, whether they will succeed or not in making the epidemic stop, that success can also be estimated by using models of this kind. So let me end by thanking you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
That was very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. I request participants, if you have any questions, please post it in the chat box.
Yeah, till Sitabra, till people type in their questions.
Okay.
Can I ask here?
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
So the network structure will depend on whether there is lockdown or no lockdown. Right? Or I mean, can one try to see what kind of structure will be there when there is a lockdown and only emergency health workers or emergency service people are doing their job? Is there any qualitative change in the network structure?
Very good question, Kiran. Okay, so in fact, indeed, it's right that the lockdown actually affects the network structure. So actually, there's an alternative way to model this. So you can actually use the compartmental model, the much more simple kind of models that we have, where you essentially have some kind of a homogeneous mixing. So what we could have is basically a large number of neighborhoods. Within each neighborhood, you essentially have this well-mixed assumption, you have homogeneous mixing, all right? And so what social distancing or physical distancing actually does in such compartmental models is that it reduces beta, the rate at which you have a contact of a susceptible and an individual, a susceptible individual and an infectious individual result in the infection passing from the susceptible to the individual. So down or a physical implementation of physical distancing would essentially mean that you would have a reduction in beta. So the more people adapting physical distancing, that means the less likely that the disease is going to propagate in that particular neighborhood.
Yeah, that is.
Okay.
So I think there is a question. Madam, you can take that.
Yeah, sure. It's from Vaibhav. Is taking initial susceptible volume equal to total population is best way to get estimate epidemic using homogeneous SIR model? or there is any other way to estimate initial susceptible population?
Well, in the simplest SIR model, which doesn't have age structure and so on, you know, say that look, the total population is the entire susceptible population. But you're right. If you want to introduce a bit more realism, so you'd say that look, people who are at peak physical health, who have a very robust immune system, are less likely to catch the disease than people who are very young, like children, or very old, senior citizens who have already some other diseases which make them liable to catch infection more easily. So you could, for example, weight the entire population with kinds of age and other demographic factors. Could do that, but typically, for simplicity, because we typically don't have all this detailed information, we usually use the simplifying assumption that the total population is that the susceptible population, at least in the initial stage of the epidemic, is equal to the total population.
Thank you, sir. There is one more question from YouTube from Mr. Chintamani Pai. Could you please throw light on how susceptible volume S in SIR model might dependent on lockdown conditions?
Sorry, can you just repeat?
Yeah, sure. Could you please throw light on how susceptible volume S in SIR model might dependent on lockdown conditions?
Okay. So, it's not so much so what you're doing is not reducing the susceptible volume. Okay. Susceptible volume still remains as it is. What you're reducing is the transmission rate of the disease, the rate at which the contact of susceptible individual and infected individual is going to result in a susceptible individual becoming infected. That rate is going to be reduced. Okay? If you are going to use a social contact network model, then it's even more direct. In the social contact network model of epidemic spreading, you actually have this quantity K, which tells you what is the average number of contacts between individuals. So a lockdown essentially is going to reduce this K drastically. So by reducing K drastically, what you're doing is you're reducing the reproduction number, because the reproduction number actually is a product of all these different quantities, the transmission rate, the average contact, the number of average contacts, and so on. So by reducing in a homogeneous model, the transmission rate beta, and in social contact network model, the average number of contacts, you're actually reducing the reproduction number. So that's why you would, for example, there are various media reports which actually mention that the reproduction number of COVID-19 in India actually reduced from something like, so for example, in our estimation, it reduced from something like 1.8 plus to about 1.3 as a result of the lockdown. So that's essentially what the lockdown does.
Okay, thank you. There is one more question or other comment. Okay. Can you suggest how I can convince the local Kiranawala to wear masks? I see all of the vegetable, fruit and grocery sellers either not wearing masks or wearing masks only covering mouth.
That's a very serious problem. I mean, I wish I could answer that. I'm probably not the best person to say this. I can only tell you, how important it is to convince these people to actually adopt safe practices. And I see that also in my own city, okay? That, the large fraction of people are not wearing masks. Even when they're wearing masks, they are not wearing it properly so that it becomes useless, whether they're wearing masks or not. When I try to converse with them, it is very apparent that they are probably not fully conscious of the danger that they are actually facing. For them, for many of them, it's like, well, maybe it's just like flu, okay? to convince them that, look, it's not flu, it's something far more insidious. It is, it has a much higher mortality rate and so on. It's sometimes hard. And sometimes also, like in other cases, I found that it's very much, they are quite aware of this optimization of the, I was mentioning, right, that any game theoretic problem is like a strategic decision making where you may have multiple aims that you're trying to optimize. So for a vendor, it is also an optimization problem, right? It's a case of, if I wear masks, am I scaring away my customers? They might think that, I have something, or, people commenting in my neighborhood that, oh, look at that idiot, he's wearing masks, all of us are going about. So there's there's this thing you want to blend in, right? You don't want to be the only guy wearing masks in your community. You'd be like considered, like a nut job, right? So there are, your payoff might be you want to fit into a society. So you need to consider all of this. I mean, it's very much a game theoretic problem in this sense that there are so many different, often competing aims that you are trying to simultaneously satisfy. And sometimes the weightage that you give to certain aims might be very different from the weightage that I'm giving to those same aims. Frankly, I'd be, let's say I belong to a community where wearing masks is not considered strange, right? So for me, it's not a big cost to, wear masks and go around. So I will not be able to conceive of the cost that, let's say, that particular vendor might be paying when he decides to put a mask and, go about. So I guess the only way that you could try to convince is, say that, look, try to understand what are the motivations which are leading that particular person not to wear a mask. And try to see if you can allay either those fears or, somehow show that those particular fears are nothing compared to, what might happen if that person gets infected.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is, how vaccination probability is pi? Can you explain?
Sorry, how vaccination probability is pi. Oh, all right. So, see, in the model, what we're doing is we are simply saying that, look, vaccination probability for each individual is some number pi, but it's different for every individual. The entire game theoretic model that we set up is for only one purpose, which is to estimate pi for every individual at each point of time. Pi is not a constant. It is different for every individual, and it differs for each individual from time to time. What is the probability of vaccination? The probability with which I will vaccinate today is going to be very different from the probability with which I might vaccinate tomorrow. And that's because my perception of how much I'm at risk from contracting the disease actually changes, right? Depending upon how many people are infected, or how much people are engaging in safe activities around me and so on.
Okay. Next question is from Sunita Marat. When do you think we will peak in Mumbai under the present situation?
Oh, I wish I knew. No, I mean, I keep getting asked by many people, because we do this estimation of the reproduction number, precisely this question. And sometimes I get asked when will it peak in India? When will it peak in Chennai? When will it peak in Maharashtra and so on? Unfortunately, none of the models that we use are able to actually give such long-term predictions. We can make very good short-term predictions, predictions at the scale of, let's say, a couple of weeks. So, if you ask me, or don't ask me though, because I'll have to now start actually doing the estimation. So, but in principle, I can tell you what it's likely to be in 2 weeks' time. But if you ask me, when will it peak, that essentially means asking, making a statement about, how it would develop over several months. Okay? So unfortunately, no model that we have can give you a very accurate estimate of this for a very simple reason. See, if the disease was following the natural dynamics, that is, if you didn't have this containment, if you didn't have this containment, people were just going about saying, okay, whatever will happen, let the disease take its course. Yes, then from estimating basic production number, I could have, made a projection and told you, this is under its natural dynamics, this is when the disease would have reached its peak. And then after that, it will start falling off. But the moment you had lockdown imposed in March, we essentially knocked off the disease from its natural course. Okay, we essentially constrained the disease so that it's growing much more slowly. And now, which way the disease will, evolve over the coming weeks and months depends very much on how people, at different parts of the country react to it, how people, adhere to all the kinds of social distancing norms, public hygiene norms, and so on. And whether, for example, governments in different states come out with, let's say, strict lockdowns. Like, for example, in Chennai, they are going to impose a strict lockdown from tomorrow until the end of this month. So all of this would, very much affect the future course of the disease. So, because you can't predict what are all the corrective actions which are going to be taken by various agencies at different points of time, you don't know how people are going to behave. It's essentially impossible to give such long-term.
Okay. Next question is from YouTube. Mr. Rajendra Singh is asking.
Rajesh Singh.
Rajesh Singh, sorry. If you see progress of COVID-19 in world graph has flattened a bit in May, but now numbers are rising again. Does it have any similarity with Karnataka village situation where disease kept returning?
Interesting question. Okay, so not really. See, the disease returning again and again in Karnataka has to do with what you might call the second wave. Okay, so people are talking about the second wave, third wave, and so on. So why does this happen in the Karnataka village situation was that people were recovering and then losing their immunity. Right? COVID, the time scale so far is still too short for people to have recovered immunity. And it's not even clear that, whether people will lose immunity. I mean, there have been various conflicting reports that, people who have been infected by COVID might have been infected again. But so far, there is no concrete information that actually COVID has infected anyone who has previously been infected by COVID and recovered. So we can assume that, people who have people who have recovered from COVID are essentially immune. What we are actually seeing is the fact that the disease has not quite run its course in all the different regions where it had broken out. Okay? So you have large pools of susceptible individuals in all of these countries where it has been contained. Okay? So, for example, Kerala, which had the first state to actually have COVID cases, had been very successful in containing COVID. Right? But last month, you had suddenly a spike of cases right there. So what happened was essentially, you had a susceptible pool. You had a very large susceptible pool. So all you need is actually some relaxation, some lack of attention in seeing how new infection cases are coming and coming in contact with the local population, and you would have another outbreak of epidemic. And this is a risk that we'll have to live with. Okay? Of course, if the disease runs its natural course and you have, let's say, more than 70% of the people getting infected and eventually recovered, of course, by that time you would have a natural herd immunity, right? By its very natural process, a few susceptible individuals who remain will be getting screened by the recovered individuals. But to get there, we'd have to pay a huge price in terms of a very high number of infections and a very high number of deaths. We don't want to go that route. Sweden, by the way, has chosen that route. Sweden has decided to, let nature take its course, let people, get immunity by this natural course. We want to go there because our, a large fraction of our citizens are, probably not in of their immune status. So we probably have a very high number of deaths if we take that course. So our best course of action is to ensure that the disease is contained to very manageable numbers so that our health infrastructure doesn't get overburdened. And we then run the risk that if we can, even if we manage to break the chain of infection, there is still a possibility that sometime in the future, infections can come from outside and another chain of epidemic. So we'll have to always be, on our guard that that doesn't happen. So until we have a vaccine available for COVID-19, we'll have to be on our guard. So constant vigilance is the.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Vaibhav. It is being observed that tropical countries are not following close to ideal epidemic curve for COVID-19. This is my general observation. Can you comment on the disease spread dependence on the weather conditions such as temperature, humidity, etc.?
Okay, so I don't know exactly what you meant by tropical countries not following the ideal epidemic curve, because as I mentioned, the ideal epidemic curve of exponential growth followed by a peak and then flattening out, that would of course be upset by any containment measures, right? So many countries have now imposed either complete or partial lockdown. It is quite possible that it is this containment measures which are causing the deviation from this ideal epidemic curve. But if I go to the second part of your question, which is, how does the transmission of COVID been affected by weather conditions? See, early on at the like around March or so, when we were doing the estimation of R0 for India, we had found that the value of India, which was about 1.83, so was at the lower end of the basic production number, which was estimated for different countries in which COVID had an outbreak. So for example, Denmark had number something close to 4, right? France at the initial stage had a number close to 1.5 and so on. But typically, we found that countries which are in the northern latitudes tended to have a higher value of R0 compared to countries which were in the southern latitudes. So we had, made the obvious conclusion that maybe this is because of climatic factors. So we looked at temperature, we looked at, humidity, we looked at sunlight exposure and so on. But we didn't find any correlation with such physical factors, which leads us to believe that maybe it's not something to do with such simple physical factors. Someone who read up on this media report on our work actually sent me an email saying that it could be related to, for example, BCG vaccination in different countries. So for some strange coincidence, countries which had high R0, which are typically in the northern latitudes, also tended to have discontinued BCG vaccination long back. Whereas countries in the southern latitudes, which had relatively lower R0, still have BCG vaccination in a high fraction of BCG vaccination coverage in the population. It's a possibility. We can't rule it out that there could be a causal relation between BCG vaccination and resistance to COVID-19, but it's something that we have not been able to explain. But looks like that there is some relation between R0 and where the outbreak is happening.
Okay, I guess there is one more question from YouTube by Mr. Chintamani Pai. Can you also discuss some aspects of weather conditions affecting transmission rate and typical modeling approach to include weather effects?
Right. So yeah, very good question. So so for example, humidity is supposed to play a very, very important role in, for example, COVID-19 transmission. The explanation goes something like this. So when you have high humidity, the particles, so when an infected person is, for example, speaking or something, so there are all these, aerosol particles which are coming out of his or her mouth and contain pathogens, and these are floating around the air. So this airborne transmission is said to be like the primary route by which infection is actually happening. Now, if you have high humidity, what is happening is that these particles are quickly gaining in weight and they are falling to the ground faster. And so they are spending less time being airborne. And so in some sense, you're reducing the probability of an airborne transmission of the pathogen and thereby reducing the transmission rate. And so the way that, for example, one can take such weather effects into account in the kind of modeling approaches I mentioned would be to, for example, have the transmission rate, the beta, depend on weather factors. So for example, if you have high humidity, that can actually effectively reduce beta. By how much it will reduce beta is, of course, something that needs to be worked out by looking at, for example, simulations which show how exactly these airborne particles accumulate humidity and how quickly they fall to the ground.
Okay, I guess that was the last question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir, for such a wonderful and insightful session.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Request Rekha madam to take over. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ratna madam. I now request Dr. Shamala Bodhane from Mumbai Sub-Regional Council of IIPT to propose a vote of thanks. Shamla madam.
Hello, thank you. I'm actually very much happy to listen to the whole explanation that Professor Sitabara Sinha has given us today regarding the spread of COVID-19. He has explained it in very, very simple way. The whole fear which is there in our mind all the time, I think we all have now understood the probability of ourselves getting affected with a number of different parameters. And I should thank him for all this lucid explanation of this whole aspect. Thank you, sir, for giving your time for our lecture and explaining all this to us in such a simple manner. I would like to thank Principal of Jhunjhunwala College, Dr. Himanshu Davda, for making this platform available for us for our lecture series. And at the same time, I would like to thank Dr. Usha Mukundan, who is Director of HVPS from the Jhunjhunwala College. The technical aspects of this whole lectures and the last two lectures also was managed by Mr. Devi Prasad Shetty, who is the technical person from Jhunjhunwala College, and also full staff of the Department of Physics of the Jhunjhunwala College. So I would like to thank the Department of Physics, all the staff members of Department of Physics of Jhunjhunwala College, and Mr. Devi Prasad from Jhunjhunwala College. At the same time, special thanks to Dr. Kiran Kolwankar for getting in touch with Professor Sitabara Sinha and making the arrangement for, getting the time slot and making the whole arrangement of this lecture with of Professor Sitabara Sinha for us. I would like to thank all the members of IIPT Mumbai region who have taken the trouble to arrange the lecture series. This today's lecture was one of this series. And at the same time, last but not least, I would like to thank all the participants of this particular program, without whom there would have been no success for any program of us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shamla madam. Thank you everyone who has joined. I would just like to make an announcement of the next lecture of this series. That is going to be on Tuesday, 23rd June. We are going to have Dr. P.S. Anil from IISc Bangalore. He is specializing in spintronics, and I expect the whole enthusiasm which will continue in the same manner. So finally, again, I request each one of you to be with us throughout the entire series, and hope to see you all again on Tuesday to meet Dr. P.S. Anil Kumar. Thank you once again, Dr. Sitabara Sinha. Thanks having you here. It was a wonderful lecture, of course, and I hope the similar cooperation and whole joint venture will continue along with the Department of Physics, RJ College, and also IIPT. Thanks once again to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I request Devi Prasad to please end the session. Thank you very much. Thanks, Devi Prasad.
Okay.